So let's have a look at what results are. I'm afraid the facts don't bear that out. Let's have a look at the results that are actually being delivered. In the 150 days since the election, more than 20,000 people dangerously and illegally crossed the English Channel. That is 18% up on the same 150 days the previous year. I don't call an 18% year-on-year increase delivering results. That is a failure. Why are these figures up year-on-year? Well, the National Crime Agency told us we need a deterrent, that law enforcement alone won't be enough, and yet the government cancelled the Rwanda deterrent before it even started. The first flight was due to take off on the 24th of July, and they cancelled it before it even took off. Now, of course, we welcome the work on law enforcement, which continues the work done by the previous government. But according to the NCA, that alone will not be enough. We need a deterrent. When will she introduce one?
I have to just gently point out to the Shadow Home Secretary that his party left us with the highest level of small boat crossings in the first half of the year on record, the highest level for that season on record. If we had carried on with small boat crossings at the level that they were in the first half of the year when he was in the Home Office, there would have been thousands more arrivals that we would have had to deal with over the last few months. When he was Immigration Minister, of course, point out to him as well that small boat crossings increased around tenfold because he let these criminal gangs take hold along the channel. They built an entire criminal industry on his watch that he did nothing to stop. And that is why we are having to deal with these criminal gangs now. And as for returns, just generally point out to them, by the time they left office, returns were down more than a quarter compared to the last Labour government because of their continued failure on returns to even get the system working. That is why we have put substantial additional resources into returns, into actually making sure that the rules are enforced, which they simply have not been for far too long. And as for the asylum backlog, perhaps he will also take responsibility for the total crashing of the asylum system in the last few months before the general election, when his party and the Home Office that he was a part of ended up cutting asylum decisions in the last few months before the general election by more than 70% compared to the beginning of the year. A shocking dereliction of duty, which meant we have had to then deal with and handle the increased backlog that his party left behind over the summer, getting that back under control. There are some important issues around the decisions on asylum cases for Syria. And let's be clear, many of the claims that have been made against the Assad regime, for asylum against the Assad regime, which is clearly not in place. It would therefore not be appropriate to be granting asylum decisions on those cases in the current circumstances. We do need to monitor the evolving situation so that we can get new country guidance in place and so that we can take those decisions. But we will do that in a sensible and serious way, which is about getting the asylum and the immigration systems back in control. In contrast to, frankly, the Shadow Home Secretary and the party opposite, who seem simply to want to go back to the Rwanda scheme, which I point out to them once again cost £700 million for the taxpayer and sent just 4 volunteers to the Kigali, the most shocking waste of public money over 2 years on a failing scheme. All they did was gimmicks instead of ever getting a grip, and all the Shadow Home Secretary wants to do is turn the clock back to failure again.
And especially the handling of public communications and the appalling riots that followed. It's a very important question. I would be grateful if the Home Secretary would directly answer that in her response. Now, the Prime Minister this morning acknowledged that he knew about the background to the case and to Radu Bakana himself, including the fact that he had been referred to Prevent on 3 separate occasions, and that Rudapakabana had been found to be in possession of ricin, a highly toxic chemical, and a manual detailing al-Qaeda terrorist methods, itself an offence under the Terrorism Act. The Prime Minister also said this morning that he did not disclose any of this to the public in the days and weeks after the murders for fear of prejudicing the subsequent murder trial. And it is, of course, important for journalists and for politicians, and indeed this House, to do nothing that might prejudice a trial. But David Hall, KC, the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, said this on the Today programme in the context of this case in October, and it bears quoting in full. Jonathan Hall said this: "The government has to be aware that if there is an information gap, then other voices, particularly on social media, will fill that gap."
He then raises the issue about the information that was provided, and he will know that the Contempt of Court Act was set out in 1981. Jonathan Hall has indeed highlighted the problem of disinformation online, social media actors who are not bound by the same rules that the police, the media and the government follow. And he refers, for example, to the name and the nationality being provided, which in practice they were in this case, after misinformation appeared online. But ultimately, he has also said all of this is governed by the Contempt of Court Act 1981, and the Law Commission is reviewing that. But it is not for the government to ignore the law or the advice that we are given when justice for families is at stake. And let me point out to him that the previous Conservative government did not publish information before the trial about the Prevent referral for the perpetrator who killed Sir David Amess. None of us criticised them for that because none of us wanted to put at risk justice for Sir David's family. Nor did they publish information before the trial on the Prevent referral of the asylum seeker who killed Tom Roberts. In fact, they didn't even publish that after the trial. It only came out in the inquest. And the minister, who even after the trial refused to answer my questions on whether they knew that he was wanted for murdering 2 people in Serbia when he was allowed to enter the country, was the current Shadow Justice Secretary.
So will the Home Secretary commission that national statutory public inquiry which can compel witnesses to attend, that can requisition evidence and where it can take evidence under oath? And if the government will not order that statutory national public inquiry, we will table an amendment to the Children Wellbeing Bill later this week to put the matter to a vote.
To say to the Shadow Home Secretary, this is an issue in which, when I was the Shadow Home Secretary, when I was the Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I worked with government ministers on, and in which there has been cross-party consensus on the need to tackle these very serious and vile crimes. These are the most appalling crimes against children. The brutal rape, the repeated multiple rapes of children, particularly young girls, but also young boys, in the most appalling of circumstances, and the abuse of trust for those children. Often it be people who should have protected them, who should have looked after them, and where institutions failed to keep them safe. That's why the independent inquiry was so important. It's why I called for it. It's why many other people in this House, across this House, called for it. And it's why we supported it when the previous government set it up. But the truth is there just has not been enough action to tackle these vile crimes. There hasn't been enough change to policies, to the way in which services operate at local level. And that is a deep failing that those changes have not taken place. He used the example of the duty to report. This is incredibly important because it is about preventing any chance of people turning a blind eye, of professionals turning a blind eye to abuse, of people covering up child abuse and exploitation in the most appalling way. It's about making it a criminal offence. And yet we called for it 10 years ago. He had a decade in order to introduce that, a decade that we have now lost without having those powers and those measures in place. He rightly talks
about the task force. I mentioned that in my response, and we've supported not just continuing with that task force, but actually accelerating its work. So it has increased. The last quarter of arrests have increased on the previous quarter, a significant increase in arrests, because the thing I want to see most of all is I want to see perpetrators behind bars. I want to see perpetrators pay the price for the vile crimes against children. And in order to do that, we have to improve policing performance and the coordinated work between police and local councils across the country in order to do this. So yes, we will accelerate the work of the task force. But he refers to the ethnicity data. It's already been published. It was published in November. The latest report was published in November as a result of the work of the task force. I would just say to him, though, I don't think that the data that they have gathered actually is adequate. I don't think it goes far enough. I think there's a real problem with the way in which we collect data, and police forces collect data. It's very haphazard. There isn't a proper system for collecting data, for having proper performance framework for policing, because again, to be honest, I think his government withdrew too far from policing and having the kind of standards we need to have in place. I hope we can work together on having a stronger performance framework, having a clearer framework of data, including dealing with these issues around ethnicity.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Labour lot over there are banging on about playing politics with this important issue. But the last time I attended a debate on child rape gangs, there was just one Labour backbencher turned up. They should hang their heads in shame. But will the Home Secretary agree with me that we need a specific inquiry into why young British white girls are being systematically raped by men of Pakistani heritage?
Secretary.
We need to make sure that young people, that children are being protected. These are vile crimes against children, and across the country we have seen young girls, we have seen teenagers, and we have seen young boys who have been exploited in the most cruel and horrendous way by perpetrators. We have seen the abuse by Pakistani heritage gangs, paedophile gangs operating online. We have seen abuse in communities and institutions and in family homes. All of those crimes are truly horrendous. It's why after the Rotherham inquiry in 2014, when we saw the appalling abuse, including by a Pakistani heritage gang in that case, I called for the duty to report. I called for the law to be changed so that it was a responsibility on public servants to report child abuse, and that it would be an offence to cover up child abuse. The government that he was part of for many years failed to bring that duty to report in. They failed to do so, and we have lost a decade. We have to change the law. We have to make sure that we go after abuse without fear or favour wherever it is found, in order to get justice for victims, protection for victims, and make sure that dangerous perpetrators end up behind bars.